Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Ms. Linda Cornish, founder and president of Seafood Nutrition Partnership.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being here at the 8th Annual State of the Science Symposium. I'm so pleased to see everyone here today. I am, of course, Linda Cornish. I'm going to be your MC for today. And I want to just thank all of us for being here and spending some time just learning more about seafood nutrition and how we can make a difference with impacting our public health through seafood nutrition. All of us hold a puzzle in terms of how to solve the issues that we have in our public health crisis. And seafood nutrition is an important part of that piece of the puzzle. 90% of Americans do not eat seafood per the dietary guidelines of at least twice a week. And moms are required and recommended to eat seafood at least 2 to 3 times a week, but they're barely reaching that limit. And so many Americans and moms and babies are missing out on the health benefits for their brain, their heart, and overall wellness. And so today we're going to share with you talks that are in TED Talk style formats of 15 minutes to help you learn new topics that are the state of the science for seafood nutrition. So as you know, we are a 501c3, so I want to just thank all of you for supporting this mission, for being here today. This State of the Science Symposium is our 8th annual and is produced by our Scientific Nutrition Advisory Council, chaired by Dr. Brenna. And our Science Symposium kicked off yesterday with an internal Scientific Nutrition Advisory Council meeting. And so many of our Science Council members are here today. The theme of this symposium is Make Every Day Count. And I hope that when you are done with today, that you'll be inspired to take action to make every day count through seafood nutrition. I hope you'll learn that seafood is a simple solution in terms of supporting reproductive health and maternal health, that the science on seafood nutrition is strong, and we have a panel of experts sharing that with you today. What's most amazing and impactful that we'll hear about today is addressing preterm birth, one of the most serious health crises we have here in America, and how we can save billions if we can actually help moms understand how to incorporate more seafood nutrition into their diets. And lastly, you know, all this talk and science is great, but we do need to help consumers actually eat it. And so we'll have the afternoon session share with you how we can do that and help consumers fall in love with seafood. So before I dive into today's agenda, I want to just take time to really thank all of you for taking a moment here to spend together with us, and also our sponsors. Our presenting sponsors are Alaska Seafood Marketing Institute, and we have some representatives here today. The National Marine Sanctuary Foundation, NOAA Fisheries, thank you so much. Our gold sponsors are Cargill and StarKist, thank you so much. And also silver sponsors are the Chilean Salmon Marketing Council, DSM Firmenich, the Global Organization for EPA DHA Omega-3s, thank you so much. And then our bronze sponsor is the Pacific Seafood Processors Association. And I also want to just take a moment to recognize members of the S&P Board of Directors that are here today. Please raise your hand. Thank you for being here. And also our Science Council, please raise your hand. Thank you so much. Many of you serve on 1 or 2 committees, so you're raising your hands a lot. Our ambassadors, our donors, our NSC task force members, our chair is here, Bill Hefner for NSC Task Force, and also our Seafood for Health Action Coalition members. I just want to thank all of you for being partners in this mission. Can you believe S&P has been around for 11 years, and the sentiments for seafood get stronger, the science is better understood, and our messaging is clear for consumers. We have a a long way to go. Those of us are here today, and also those that are watching from YouTube, we are broadcasting this live via live stream. If you're on social media, I encourage you to help post about this information from the symposium today. The hashtags to use are hashtag seafood, the number 4 health. That's also our social media accounts at Seafood for Health. And then hashtag SOSS24 for State of the Science Symposium 2024. So without much further ado, I do want to bring up our first presenter, Dr. Martin Paul Agbaga. He is assistant professor in the Department of Ophthalmology at the Dean McGee Eye Institute at the University of Oklahoma Health Science Center. So I'd love to bring up Dr. Martin Paul to share his great talk today.
Thank you very much, Linda, and thank you all for coming. I love the Seafood Nutrition Partnership, what they are doing, and I'm excited to share with you some of the work we've been doing. My background, I started off in retina. When I was in college, my dad had glaucoma. We went to the doctor, and long story short, I devoted my life to research in the eyeball. And that's what I'm going to talk to you, how I started from the eyeballs to the low balls. And I would explain what I mean by that. As you will see up here, like my friend Tom Brenna likes to say, the eyeballs in the eye, you have what we call the omega-3 fatty acids that are derived from fish oil. And these omega-3 fatty acids are elongated into what we now call the very long-chain polyunsaturated fatty acids. But then we also found out that whatever is in the eye is in the low balls, the testicles and the sperm. With all apology to the men, don't be blushing. There also you have the very long chain or the DHA-derived fatty acid that we have shown that are important for fertility. And how did I start? Like I said, when I came to the US, I worked with Dr. Gina Anderson. At the time, they just discovered a gene that is called the elongation of very long chain fatty acids 4 gene, ELOVL4. You will see to the right over there. There is a mutation in this gene, and children, by the time they are in their teenage years, they begin to lose vision. So you see the top image over there, the dark red spot we call the macula, the cells are already degenerated. And therefore, whilst the normal vision, you will see in the bottom, you will see those 2 nice kids, these target patients, end up having a central vision loss. So by the time most of them are in their 30s, they are legally blind. And so my research at the time is to figure out what this gene is doing. When you are a young, naive graduate student, you think it's going to be easy. Within 2 years, you'll get your doctorate. Welcome to nightmare. After 4 or 5 years of trying to figure out the function of this gene, fail. Thank God for Thanksgiving. And on Thanksgiving 2007, I discovered the function of ELOVL4 and unequivocally demonstrated that what it does, it takes fish oil, DHA, EPA, or arachidonic acid, and elongate them into what we now call the very long-chain polyunsaturated fatty acid. These are fatty acids that are 28 all the way to 38 or more carbons that are found in the retina. When we got that, other people also started looking, and they used human donor eyes, and they clearly show that when we are young, we have a lot of this fatty acid, but when you get to the age of Tom Brenna going, Tom, I'll be on you because you're my friend, the VLCP first begin to decrease. But if you have macular degeneration or AMD, your VLCP5 even go much more worse. So there is a connection between these two. But then based off of this discovery, I made this model that everybody uses to define the very long chain polys. So the question is, when I made this discovery in cell culture, is it really happening in vivo in animal models? So we made an animal model where we delete the ELOVL4. When you delete the ELOVL4, you will lose the product. You will not make the very long-chain fatty acid. And if it is true that these fatty acids are really important for retinal function, we expect that the animals that we deleted the gene from, they will be blind. Of course, the mice will not tell you, oh, Martin Paul, I am blind. And so what we use is what we call electroretinography. What it is you take your either the normal animals that we call the wild type or your deleted animal, in this case, the green ones. The top one, the black one, are your normal wild type or normal animals. And you flash a light to these animals in the dark, and if their retina is functioning, they will respond on the computer screen at the top. They will tell the photoreceptors will give you a very beautiful response, as you can see. And we show clearly that the normal animal had really very robust phenotype. They can see very well. But the mutant animals that we deleted the gene in, the sick animals, they are not able to see. So you can see that the lower amplitude in the green signal in those animals. So this clearly shows that these fatty acids are important for the eyeball and for retinal health. We are working on that, and I am very grateful for Dr. Alan Ramale and Chiffon, who have been collaborating with to see if we can get this fatty acid to restore vision. And that will hopefully be another talk for another day. And thank you, Alan, for coming with your lab members. And while we were doing that, I discovered something, that the animals, we just took one of the copy of the gene, they were not reproducing very well on the graph at the top right over there. You delete a gene, and while the normal animals will produce 5 pups, these guys were only producing about 2 or 3 animals, and it was really frustrating. So I'm like, what is going on? And I remember we did a study back in 2010 that we published with Dr. Nakamura, where we had delta-6 desaturases, which is at the top, that make all the precursors for ELOVL4. We deleted it. And what we found out is that in the animals that we delete the gene, their frequency of mating was significantly reduced. You put females in there, they are like, I don't care. And then we're like, how about if you give them DHA, will they shoot? And we gave them DHA. So to the top right, a middle panel there, when we gave DHA, all of a sudden these guys became very virile, chasing the females around the cage. So the frequency of mating increased significantly. And we look at their sperm quality, and sperm quality was fantastic. Their sperm quality also improved, which means that DHA is important for fertility in that study we said. But I'm like, how about the very long-chain polys? And you look at sperm quality in this animal. So when we look at the chromatogram of those animals, we saw that the DHA we gave them was also elongated to the very long-chain polyunsaturated fatty acids. And they also produce steroids. That makes sense. Now they have all the good hormones. Now the females look attractive to them, and they are doing what they are supposed to do. So based off of that, I'm like, how about human? What happens? And remember, we all started from the sea. You can argue about that. We start from the sea, and we are swimmers. Male fertility is all about swimming. The better swimmer you are in terms of the sperm, you find your target. And even when the sperm meets the egg, the acrosomal reaction, this all depend on fatty acids. So we started looking at male fertility to see how does loss of this fatty acid affect male fertility. And in my study, I found out that if you look in that blacks, there are some nice sperm. There is also some ghost sperms at the background over there, as you can see. And so I did some more study, and I found out that a study that was published in 2010 2017 and eventually redid in 2022 has clearly shown that within the past 30, 40 years, there is 50% reduction in sperm count and is continuing decreasing. So sperm volumes are going down. In other words, those of us who like to see statistics and graphical pictures, this is what is happening. In the 70s, when my father and my grandfathers are shooting, they are producing about 101 sperm particles per mil. But then my generation, we are only producing about 49. So what is really happening? So what we did is we did a study where in the US, the incidence of male fertility is increasing. And the reason why there is decline in male factor infertility is not really understood. And so I'm like, well, in my animal, the only thing that is happening is a dietary factor. So can diet or the loss of this fatty acid be contributing to this pathology? So I found also this study that was done in Spain, where males that grow up along the sea, they eat a lot of seafood, they tend to have a bigger sized testicle and produce more volume of sperm than if you are just taking arachidonic acid. It begins to shrink your testicles and reduce your sperm count. And remember, our diet is now so high in omega-6 fatty acids. So we decided to do a study at our university where we have clinicians that were treating male factor infertility patients. We enrolled 70 young men, and then we did sperm analysis. We collected sperm. We determined the quality, how fast did the sperm swim, and then we did our lipid analysis. And what we found out clearly is the more VLCP4 you have, the better swimmers you are going to have. They swim really fast. And they are not just a better swimmers, it also correlated very positively with the sperm count. So more sperm you have, it also positively correlates with the amount of VLCP that you have, which clearly shows that this DHA derived. So when we find out like, oh, really? Could it be coming from DHA? So we did fatty acid analysis, and you can see the 22, 6, and 3 is there, and that is what is contributing to this very beautiful correlation that very long-chain polyunsaturated fatty acids are critical for the next generation. And you need to have a very good sperm. We published this paper with Dr. Latasha, Craig, Richard, and others who did a really very wonderful job on this publication. When we published it, one of our colleagues had about 200 sperm. They did a study called the Amigo study of unexplained semen, people who were having problem reproducing. So we went back and then we said, okay, they were treating them in the clinic, and we analyzed the sperm and asked the question, when you are treated with this diet and you have more VLCP4, can you give birth, live birth? And what we found is that the more VLCP4 you have, the better swimmers you have 72% more likely chance of giving birth than if you have a lower level of VLCP4. We published this paper also recently, which gets to the core of the fact that very long-chain polyunsaturated fatty acids are essential for normal sperm structure and function, and that when they are not there, you're going to have a problem with your eyeballs and your low balls. So what do we do? Now we know the facts. You are going to hear from Susan, preterm birth. If we are having low fertility count to begin with and we are having a low birth preterm problems, it's going to be a problem. So we need to do something about it. There are so many factors that could be contributing to this. But for me today, my message to you is about diet. The American diet had become so N6 rich. For this audience today, I am calling us to embrace seafood. Welcome seafood. I was talking to Joe yesterday, and Joe told me in his clinic he gives fish oil to patients, and he warns them when you start taking this fish oil, you are going to have adverse effect. Your hair is going to grow, your skin is going to grow, and you're going to be looking beautiful. Your mood will change. You'll be happy all the time. And they left. So what did they say? They came back later. They said, Doc, you made a big mistake. You did not warn us of another side effect, which is even more important. As soon as I started taking this fish oil, I started getting honey and looking for honey. VLC puffer are important for fertility. It changes your mood and puts you in the mood. So my take-home message for you today is that VLC puffer are important for our brain and retina function. They are important for our fertility and for the next generation. So let's embrace seafood intake. And another story I'm not telling you today, it also supports the skin health, because when we knock out this gene, the animals also do have a skin pathology. I wanted to study skin, and my professor, Dr. Anderson, told me, Maternal, draw in your tentacles and focus. And so I focus on this. So my message to us today, take seafood, and guess what? I'm not saying take the candle over there, but when you take seafood, you can light that candle, and like the Frenchman will say, ah, ma chérie, bien ici. Thank you.
One comment to add with regard to gender differences. And the patients alerted me that they became more amorous, and it is, yes, in resulting in the literature for men, especially for vascular effects, but the effect for women was to have more and better orgasms.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, before Dr. Ramali asked his question, one thing I didn't tell you, when we were doing our studies, one of my friends who has been married for almost 8 years, they were not having children. I started giving him fish oil. About 6 or 8 months later, he called me, Maternal, it is in. It's in the oven. I'm like, what's in the oven? He said, my wife is pregnant. That boy is 10 years now. That is an N of 1. Dr. Anderson would say N of 1 is only significant when somebody dies or you give birth. So I can take that to the bank. Dr. Ramali?
Martin Paul, wonderful talk as usual.
Thank you.
You mentioned elongase 4, and I know you know a lot about elongase 2.
Right.
And elongase 2 is one of the best biologic clocks of aging. So I wonder if male infertility as men get older relates to decreased activity of elongase 2, and whether older men who are trying to have children might benefit from very long-chain PUFA supplementation.
That's a very good question. So we actually have the elongase 2 knockout animals we got from Moderator. Actually, that was the animals we used with your study as well. Yeah, so once you have the elongase 2, which is upstream of 4, it's just like the desaturase 2, you're going to have fertility problems. And that's perhaps as the reason why when we get older, our elongase 2 goes down, you decrease precursors, so you lose VLC-P5, and that's probably why you get older, you are no longer in the mood, but fish would help you. Did I see another hand? All right, well, thank you all so much. And Linda, thank you for the organization and the invitation.
So Dr. Martin Paul had some mentions of omega-6 and omega-3, and so our diets have in the U.S. a lot more omega-6s, which are usually more pro-inflammatory, and so omega-3s are more anti-inflammatory. And so hopefully you can see the point that having more omega-3s is very healthy for reproductive health. Next up, we have new clinical guidelines to share with you. Dr. Susan Carlson.
more than 1 out of 10 babies is actually born preterm, which means before 37 weeks. And the March of Dimes gives us a D+ for maternal health around this issue. And as you can see from the slide, there's quite a bit of difference among the states in the United States, but when I say 10%, it's across the board. Black moms, non-Hispanic black moms have the highest rates, about 50% higher than everyone else. But I'm going to tell you the punchline of my talk right now. Look at those numbers, and what if we could get those numbers for everyone, including black moms, down to 6%? We think we can with omega-3 fatty acids. So there is strong evidence in a scientific audience. If you start out and say there's a Cochrane review that says there's strong evidence that omega-3 fatty acids reduce preterm birth, less than 37 weeks again, or early preterm birth, less than 34 weeks, which are the most consequential, costly, stressful for families, births. You can reduce them by at least 42%. Keeping in mind, there's about 5,000 women in this review. Now, after this was published in 2018, we published a clinical trial that was funded by the NIH. It was a multi-site trial with 1,100 women, and a group in Australia published the ORIB trial, which had about 5,400 women. And both trials were not a success in the conventional way, because what we found in both trials was that only the women who started with low DHA status had a reduction in early preterm birth and preterm birth. Why might that be? We think it's because in Australia and the US around 2008, prenatals with DHA started to come into the market, and half the women in our trial were taking DHA on the day that we enrolled them. So, I'll show you, well, I'll get a little ahead of myself here. So DHA intake is very low among US pregnant women. It's found in few food sources. If you look there, you see the really good sources are seafood. We have a seafood intake problem in this country for everyone, but particularly you will note there that 0% of the 1,180 pregnant women in the NHANES survey consumed at least 8 ounces of seafood per week, which is even ACOG and the dietary guidelines for America recommend 8 to 12 ounces of seafood per week for women who are pregnant or considering becoming pregnant or even in their pregnancy years. So the intake is actually closer to, in our trial was 84 milligrams per day on average, but there are reports as low as 54. And I want to tell you this because it was important as we developed the guidelines that you know, because in these clinical trials we measure blood levels of DHA, so we know whether there's adherence, and we know what the women's DHA status is. But what I'm going to show you in a few minutes is that it makes a difference what your status is when you start. On the other hand, if you think of every pregnancy, we have approximately 4 million every year in the US alone. There's just not the capacity to measure the blood level of DHA in every pregnant woman to give her advice. So we validated a 7-question food frequency questionnaire, and I will show you as my last slide. You can use the barcode and check your own DHA intake. But with 7 questions, 3 of which have to do with fish of different amounts of omega-3 fatty acid, fish categories in them, and then including egg yolk and chicken, which are kind of low. We did this test in 1,305 women that were enrolled in our trials in Kansas City. And we found that a baseline intake of 150 milligrams per day was kind of the cutoff for women who had the poorest DHA status. So just a couple of slides I'm going to show you from our clinical trial. And if you sort of orient to your left, women who had low baseline DHA status when they enrolled in the trial, which was a red blood cell DHA phospholipid level lower than 6%, had a conventionally significant reduction in preterm birth. And that happened whether they had low baseline status or on the other side of the screen, high baseline DHA status. They both had about a 27% reduction. And these are intention to treat data, I want to emphasize. We published an adherence later. We get even better results if we look at whether they actually took it. But this was so for less than 37 weeks. If you look on the left side, you will see that the preterm birth rate less than 34 weeks was reduced by half among low baseline DHA status, but no further benefit on the high baseline DHA status because they already had an extremely low rate of early preterm birth. And this is the same kind of orientation, only instead of talking about status, we're talking about their baseline DHA intake. The way it's not based on any kind of a clinical practice guideline. And I was asked to write an article promoting this idea, and I said, this is not the way we should go. We need to make this more of a consensus kind of process. And contacted Bert Koletzko, who I'd worked with before on other projects. He has begun the Charitable Child Health Foundation in Munich some years ago. And he invited Irene Satan from Milan, and the three of us put together this panel that developed the guidelines, and I'm going to go through the process a little bit for you. The scientific manager was Dr. Franziska Feldy. So that guideline was published earlier this year in AJOG MFM, the American Journal of Obstetrics and Gynecology, and it's entitled Omega-3 Fatty Acid Supply in Pregnancy for Risk Reduction of Preterm and Early Preterm Birth. You can see that there are already 7 organizations that have signed on to this. They've made it the standard in Europe, in their OB organization there. And there were 24 authors from 15 countries and all continents. There are a couple of the authors with us that are in this room today. I would just call out Bill Harris and Gretchen Van Eys. So the method is that we developed this steering committee and drafted, Gretchen and I actually drafted the initial manuscript, which really went through the evidence. What is the evidence that we should have a guideline around this? That was a rather extensive document. We went through a various editing process with Dr. Satan, Dr. Koletzko, and myself, and when we had a document that we all were happy with, we shared it with the other members of the guidelines committee. They had a time to review, comment. Then we had a consensus meeting in May of last year, discussed, revised. There was a lot of discussion. There were some points in the guidelines that people weren't sure about. Several of the obstetricians didn't really know about omega-3 fatty acids. We had to convince them on the evidence. We had to talk through the evidence. And then in the end, after a couple of meetings, we had anonymous voting on 10 proposed conclusions. A third conclusion was added later by a family group, a group that advocates for family, and we voted on that one as well. I think there was 100% consensus on that. So we defined strong consensus as greater than 95% of the 24. Consensus is 75 to 95, and you see we didn't have anything that was below that. So these are the conclusions. Intakes, and we started with safety because, believe me, the obstetricians, their biggest concern was safety. Intakes of up to 1,000 milligrams per day of DHA and EPA or up to 1,000 milligrams per day of DHA alone do not raise safety concerns. And we had a consensus of close to 90% on that point. I could say more about that, but observational studies and randomized controlled trials in pregnant women should show lower intakes of fish and lower blood levels of the omega-3 fatty acid DHA and EPA found in fish are associated with a significantly increased risk of preterm and early preterm birth. Again, we had consensus. And women of childbearing age should aim to obtain a regular supply of omega-3 fatty acids from foods, providing these fatty acids, including fish and oily fish, and or from supplements providing DHA and EPA or DHA alone. And we have strong consensus on that. For the general population, including women in their childbearing years, a regular intake of at least 250 milligrams per day, DHA plus EPA, as recommended by the European Food Safety Authority, is desirable. We had strong consensus on that point. For pregnant women, an additional intake of at least 100 to 200 milligrams DHA per day, as recommended by the EFSA, is desirable. Again, everyone agreed to that point. All 24 people to agree on all of these was not, I think it's an accomplishment in itself. Pregnant women with low DHA intake and or low DHA blood levels are at increased risk of preterm and early preterm birth and should receive a regular supply of about 600 to 1,000 milligrams per day of DHA plus EPA or DHA alone, based on results of randomized controlled trials demonstrating significant reduction in preterm and early preterm birth. And we had consensus again. This additional supply should preferably begin in the second trimester of pregnancy and not later than 20 weeks gestation. High-dose supplementation with the goal of risk reduction of preterm birth should continue as long as there is a risk of preterm birth, that is until about 37 weeks of gestation, or until childbirth if before 37 weeks. This was actually a point of contention because those of us who don't think there's any risk to DHA were going, why can't we just say, take it? I don't think any OB is going to tell a woman to stop taking it at 37 weeks. And there's probably a lot of advantages for her to continue taking it because if she breastfeeds, her milk will have more DHA, and we know that's a good thing. But again, this is where the OBs and the nutritionists kind of diverged a little bit. Identification of women at increased risk of preterm and early preterm birth due to low DHA intake and or low DHA blood levels is achievable by screening with a few questions on dietary intake of foods rich in DHA and EPA. This was actually a surprise to me because I thought they would push back more on that than on the blood level, but they on the blood level, they said this is another way we can do it, but we need more standardization of methods. And that is indeed true because there are different ways people can measure DHA in blood with red blood cells, with plasma, with phospholipids. So there is no standard for this at the moment. And it is important, this was the last one that was added was suggested after the process. It is important to provide women of childbearing age, pregnant women, and their partners with evidence-based information, preferably both verbally and in writing, on how to achieve an appropriate intake of DHA or DHA plus EPA for women of childbearing age and pregnant women. So after we completed this, we published something else later this summer because the secondary analysis of our ADORE trial was to look at race. If you're doing a trial our hypothesis was the DHA would reduce preterm and early preterm birth, but we didn't know if it would work the same for everyone. So we published this later. If I can get it. Oh, before I go there, forgot I put this one in. I just wanted to put this up because this is a table right out of the guidelines paper, and if you look at that, all the the obstetricians actually requested we put this table in. They wanted to know what foods have DHA that we can tell our patients. And you can see there's very high categories of DHA, EPA. There's sort of a middle one, and then there's getting down into the lower categories. And they're all fish. They're all seafood, except when you get over to the lower categories, you can see eggs and chicken and maybe liver, which not everybody eats. So after we published the guidelines, we published this paper this summer in AJOG MFM. It was a letter. And I want to show you this because, and take you through it kind of slowly. The red lines for the preterm birth and early preterm birth that you see are the national averages for preterm and early preterm birth. But one of the things that you can see clearly here is that women with low baseline DHA status, whether they were Black or other races, have the highest rates of preterm birth, and they have the highest rates of early preterm birth. And when they got the high DHA dose, that helped a little bit in most of these cases. But if they started with high baseline DHA status and they got the high DHA dose, they had the lowest rates. And particularly, I want to point your attention to the green line in the Black moms on preterm birth, on the extreme left, because that number, 6.4%, is not different from the 5.8% we saw in other races. So in Black women, it actually brought them, if they started with high status and they got the high dose, they are not different in terms of preterm birth from women from other races. And this is a huge thing. It doesn't explain all preterm birth in the Black population and the disparity that we have, but it goes a long way to saying that we can do a lot better with moms. And what you see over there on the early preterm birth side, the Black moms still had about a 2% rate of early preterm birth, but they went down from 8%. 8% of the moms in our studies who were Black, who started with low baseline DHA and got the low dose, remember, not a placebo, had an 8% rate of birth before 34 weeks. So this is just the graphic that we have for the paper, and it speaks to what I just told you, how much moms should have when they're in childbearing years, how much they should get if they're not getting that in their childbearing years, either a little bit extra or a lot more if they're getting it in their childbearing years. And the only thing I would say here now is, since we published these guidelines in February, I would say that Black women need to be getting the 250 milligrams for sure and getting the higher dose during their pregnancies. And this is one of the things we're working on right now. And I think that's it. I don't know if I have time to do the takeaways, but I think I've made my points. So I will just go right to this, and maybe you can take a picture and check your own DHA intake. And I will take questions if you have.
Thank you, Dr. Carlson. I think as we've been going through these guidelines, I have seen your talk about stopping DHA at 37 weeks for pregnant moms. I didn't quite understand that, and I thought maybe that was because the baby would be so comfortable they never wanted to come out because of the DHA. But
No.
is there a reason why you stop at 37 weeks?
No, it was because the guidelines say to reduce risk of preterm birth, and there was one group, mostly the obstetricians, that said, well, if you get to 37 weeks, you've reduced preterm birth, so why do we need to keep saying it, right? But we never said the doctor needs to tell them to stop taking it. We just said until at least 37 weeks. So I finally went along with that comment.
Joe Hibbeln here. As a follow-on to that, for the sake of the mother, there are meta-analyses that a gram a day of omega-3 fatty acids rich in EPA prevent and treat perinatal depression. So apart from the reduction of preterm birth, mothers will be less depressed and more attentive to their children if that guideline is followed through past 37 weeks.
Yes, we're not telling people to stop. I would not say that. I think it's important, as I said before, for human milk. There's somebody over here.
Hi, thank you. That's a great talk. So I wanted, my question really centers around kind of some other social determinants of health related to your guidelines.
Yes.
The guidelines assume, evidence-based information assumes access to care systems. that can give them that information, assumes, and getting more seafood assumes access to quality food systems. So there's intersections there, I think, specifically with some of the data you showed on race and the map you showed. There's increasingly, in some of those states where there are higher rates of preterm birth, we're seeing increasing reproductive health care deserts. So I wonder if you can speak a little bit to some of those other social determinants and access in order to get the information and the quality food and things that these moms really need to reduce their preterm birth. If you could speak to that a bit. Thank you.
You make a fantastic point. When you make guidelines, the first step is to get some guidelines, right? These are new. When we disbanded the group, the first thing we did was have a conversation and say, doesn't stop here. There are steps that need to go beyond this in terms of access. And trust me, I live in a state or work in a state that's got a lot of rural where we've lost. It's a crisis in this country, but I know it firsthand from our own state that we are not getting care to pregnant women. Some women are driving 2 or 3 hours for prenatal care. We're having a lot of conversations in our own university. I think we all need to do our part, but it's also access to the foods, which I know the Seafood Nutrition Partnership has been working hard to help people understand what kind of seafood might be affordable, how to get it into the WIC program, how to get access. So the 24 people that were involved in this, we agreed, we'll keep working on this, we'll work wherever we can. I've been to ACOG the last 2 years and talked, and it's amazing the number of OBs in the room that come up afterward and say, I never heard of omega-3. There was a session on preterm birth at ACOG this year that mentioned a lot of things that can be used for various clinical problems, but omega-3s are the only generalizable effect that's ever been, the only generalizable strategy that's ever been shown to reduce preterm birth if you're not having something like preeclampsia or hypertension or whatever the other problems are that lead to preterm birth. But as you can see, I don't think DHA is going to reduce every preterm birth in this country, but it's reducing a lot of them, and it seems to be, I didn't get into this, but it seems to be around spontaneous preterm births, not the ones that can be prevented by aspirin.
We're going to cover the topic of how strong is seafood nutrition science. And Dr. Tom Brenna will be moderating. He is the chair of the Seafood Nutrition Partnership's Scientific Nutrition Advisory Council. Oh, come on. Oh, you're getting mic'd. Okay. He is professor of pediatrics, chemistry, and nutrition at Dell Medical School at UT Austin. Dr. Joseph Hibbeln is a nutritional psychiatrist, doctor, and former acting chief of NIAAA, also a member of the S&P Scientific Nutrition Advisory Council. Mr. Phil Spiller is former director of seafood at the FDA. And then Dr. Nick Ralston is director of Sage Green with NRG, and it has deep expertise in selenium. So we welcome our panelists today for a lively discussion on how strong is seafood nutrition science.
Okay, very good. I'm going to more or less be a moderator here, and I was thinking that Dr. Carlson had an easier job because she only had to follow Martin Paul. We've got to follow Martin Paul and Dr. Carlson. So you heard today about some of the newer material on omega-3 fatty acids, really kind of specific to that, omega-3s being a component of seafood and seafood being a rich source of omega-3s in general. Here we're going to focus more on seafood nutrition specifically and the strength of the science. And you've got strength of science on omega-3s. We'll now talk about strength of the science on seafood specifically. Our panel today has, oh God, I hadn't even thought about it, just popped into my head to add up all of our collective experience, and we'd be well beyond a century, I think, messing around with this stuff. But I'd like to start talking a little bit about there's a slide advancer somewhere. Thank you very much. Oops, back. Oh, that's us. Okay, there we are. Okay, how strong is the seafood? How strong is the science on seafood nutrition? Now, there is quite a history of science in seafood nutrition, and I'd like to first call upon Philip Spiller, who has been around this field of seafood nutrition as long as anyone, to tell us a little bit about the strength of science, and perhaps even the early days of starting with maybe the early days and of advice on seafood and sort of where we've come from and how we got here.
Get this to work. Is it?
It's on.
Am I on? Okay. The early days are roughly around the year 2000, with a report from the National Academy of Sciences, where they were asked to, by one of the federal agencies, in this case it was EPA, to help them calculate a better, what they call a reference dose for methylmercury, not for seafood per se, but for methylmercury per se. But in so doing, they came to a conclusion which startled a lot of people. It caught us at FDA when I was there at that time quite by surprise, and caused a bit of a sensation to the point of panic, where they said in the intro, 60,000 babies are being born at risk in the United States every year due to methylmercury in seafood. And we found ourselves being barraged with inquiries about, well, what are you doing about it? And the first thing we did was we wrote to the National Academy and we said, what do you mean? Could you please explain what at risk means the way you understand it? And they actually, to their credit, they wrote back to us and they said that in the letter, it was a short letter, but they said they admitted that they had no idea, there was no way for them to know whether there was any harm to occurring to any of these 60,000 babies born a year at risk. But nonetheless, the pressure was on my agency to do something. And so it was decided, since we didn't have any more data than they did, there really was no data on what was the effect of eating seafood on babies' health, particularly on neurodevelopment, because the concern was on neurodevelopment.
And we're in the year 2000, roughly.
We were in the year 2000. So it was decided at FDA that what we would do was issue consumption advice to pregnant women. It's the first time that was thought of. It was as a consequence of the concern about 60,000 babies. And it was decided that the consumption advice would recommend to pregnant women a limitation. Don't eat more than X. And then we had to figure out what X was. And we had, again, with no data, a very data-driven organization, we said there's no scientific basis right now. We don't have the evidence to give an X based on scientific data. So it was decided that it would be done on precaution as a matter of prudence. And we were going to come up with a number. And so it was decided that the number would be 12. And 12 was decided so as not to undermine the American Heart Association's then recommendation not to eat less than to eat at least 2 servings of seafood per week.
2 servings making 12 ounces, right?
Well, that was our interpretation, not theirs. They just said, the American Heart Association said 2 servings. We decided that was going to be 12. So we decided that if they're saying eat that much, we were going to say to pregnant women, but don't eat any more than that.
So what you're saying is that you didn't have the kind of survey of what women were eating and whether their birth outcomes or their children are doing well. You came up with the best number you could, also known as possibly pulling it out of a hat, but it was more or less your best guess.
It was a best guess.
Okay.
Yes, it was.
And so then fast forward a bit, there's been a lot of work done since then, hasn't there?
Yes, that would be an understatement. At that time, when all of this that I'm describing occurred, there was zero. We had no studies, no evidence with regard to seafood consumption eaten as a whole food during pregnancy. To this day, there has been such an incredible avalanche of data of studies being conducted in the United States, in Europe, and in Asia. And by my count, there are now approximately 30, I would say approximately, there are 32 studies that I count, and the total number of mother-child pairs in those studies is now in the ballpark of 300,000. And what I kept looking for was, in any of these studies, did they report harm? Because a lot of times in each one of the cohorts, there are people that eat hardly any seafood. There are people that eat a little bit. And then there are some people that eat a lot, way over what's normally in the United States. And none of these studies are not reporting harm. And sometimes they measure the methylmercury along with the amount of seafood consumed, and the methylmercury is quite high, and they still find no harm. With regard to the benefits, they found a total in those studies, by my count, of 55 times in which eating more seafood was more beneficial than eating less or none for some domain of neurodevelopment, one of the most notable being IQ. And the studies that show benefits to IQ range from a couple of IQ points up to a high of about 6.
Thanks. I'm gonna get Dr. Hibbeln in here to talk about some of these benefits. Dr. Hibbeln's a psychiatrist who has run a research laboratory for many years at the NIAAA, and so and I think you've studied these things.
Yes, and it's critical. I want to make one coda from Phil's comments, and the opposite of benefits is harms, and there is a harm in these studies, and the harm is following the U.S. dietary advice to eat low seafood or eat no seafood. And what we did in 2007 was to test the dietary advice in a population of 15,000 women in England, finding that when women followed the advice and ate little seafood or no seafood, it doubled the risk of low IQ in their children, because the advice was solely focused on a theoretical guess of mercury levels and completely ignored brain nutrients and selenium in seafood counts.
So you would call that a key benefit, addressing our second question of seafood consumption for maternal health and baby brain development.
Yes, indeed. With regards to how strong is the science on seafood nutrition, to evaluate this question, we have to look at various levels of science: epidemiological data across countries, longitudinal studies, biochemistry studies in rodents, and mechanistic studies in rodents, and clinical studies in humans. In summary, my opinion is that the data is consistent for the health benefits of seafood across all of those different levels of analyses, impacting multiple health outcomes, from the brain to the heart to the skin to cancer, distilling pretty much in consensus reasonable amounts of seafood and omega-3s that should be consumed.
So we have a third question, which is how much seafood can expectant moms eat? And both of you have addressed this question in your careers. I'll take an answer from either one of you on that question.
I would like to reiterate Phil's findings that in the studies where women ate huge amounts of seafood, well beyond what are advised levels, there was no evidence of harm. And when they ate diets deficient in seafood and low levels, there is evidence of harm, likely due to inadequate intakes of omega-3s. Seafood I describe as a bag of brain nutrients. And we evolved on seafood. When you don't eat it, you become deficient. Can't say exactly the parameter of which nutrient, but a seafood deficiency. And you can eat as much as you want.
Maybe Phil can make a comment on that amount.
There have been a number of survey research studies of what pregnant women are eating, amounts that pregnant women are eating. One actually quite recently that shows it's very low. But FDA did one, which there was one before it and one after it, and what FDA did somewhat in the middle, it was around 2010, was reasonably consistent with the one before and one after. And what they showed was that, or what the women surveyed, and it was about 1,000 women, that when they became pregnant, they reduced their consumption down to about 1.8 ounces per week. And they did so out of concern for safety. And in the studies with 300,000 mother-child pairs, their consumption down at that level, there's consumption higher. And at the very high ends are actually somewhat breathtaking. They go up as high as 80, 90, and even as much as 100 ounces a week, which I found rather astounding. I still do. But nonetheless, that's what the studies report, and they are reporting no harm even at those levels.
So that 80, 90, or 100 ounces a week is as contrasted with, let's say, a recommendation of 8 to 12 ounces a week in the United States. So there are places, certainly places in the world that eat a lot more seafood than in the United States. So I want to get my friend Dr. Ralston in here. And now, one of the things that we get questioned on all the time when we're recommending seafood and talking about these kinds of results is, well, what about mercury? Isn't mercury a problem? Too much mercury will be an issue. Now, in 2000, as you just heard, it out of an abundance of caution, you might say, right, well, we better study this. Well, we kind of have studied it, and the one of the leading people studying it is Dr. Ralston. And what can you tell us about mercury and I think selenium's your favorite element?
Well, yeah, you could say that. I've been working on selenium for the past 30 years. Started off doing selenium as a nutrient, and it's hugely important in the brain. It turns out that it prevents and reverses oxidative damage, especially in tissues such as the brain, which are rich in polyunsaturated fatty acids and consume a lot of oxygen, so there's potential for damage. It turns out there's nothing in the world that can stop your brain from having the selenium it needs except one thing. I bet you can guess what that is. Mercury. Mercury has a huge binding affinity for selenium. If you get too much mercury, it will bind your selenium, and those lovely enzymes that are supposed to protect and reverse oxidative damage in your brain and your endocrine tissues in your heart throughout the body, those enzymes will cease working. And guess what the consequences of mercury toxicity are? You have oxidative damage to the tissues I just described. It turns out that if you're consuming a food that has a lot of mercury and very little selenium, yeah, particularly for a mother that's developing a fetus, that brain needs plenty of selenium, but if there's too much mercury, the selenium can't get there. I got into this issue imagining that ocean fish must have huge amounts of mercury and very little selenium, and I thought, wow, that explains global stupidity because people are eating too much fish. It turned out when I got into the issue, well, fish have a ton of selenium in them and very little mercury in comparison. Where did this whole problem about supposedly seafood having a lot of mercury in it come from? It turned out it was one study done in the Faroe Islands where 85% of the mercury came from eating whale meat, not fish. The whale meat has 5 times more mercury than selenium. And guess what? If you're getting 5 times more mercury than selenium and you're a pregnant mom, that could cause trouble. It did cause trouble in the Faroes. In fact, if those moms had not been eating ocean fish, which are uniformly rich in selenium relative to mercury, their babies probably would have been severely impaired. As it was, they were fortunate. They were eating ocean fish.
But even in that case, the ocean fish protected them. So even eating, but whales, of course, are not a part of seafood as it is defined in the U.S., and so marine mammals are not part of it.
Exactly. I was working with EPA funding. The majority of my career has been EPA funded.
Environmental Protection Agency.
Oh, okay, yeah. And one of their folks told me, well, the reason why we based all of our warnings on the Faroes instead of on the Seychelles, which was an island nation where they eat only ocean fish and far more, they're exposed to far more mercury, but so much more selenium, there isn't a consequence. They didn't base their findings at the EPA on the Seychelles work because there were no findings of harm. In fact, there are benefits. So you can only predict risk if you find harm. So they base their findings, their risk analysis on the Faroes. But who eats whale meat aside from the people in the Faroes?
It's a bit striking looking at some of the data, not all of the data, but a bit of the data in the Seychelles, and I'll speak for myself having looked at a little of it, showing more mercury predicts better IQs in the kids. You say, well, how's that? Well, it's a marker for fish consumption and maybe selenium. Do you have a comment, Dr. Hibbeln?
As I was listening to Nick over all these years, I think I distilled the issue is that mercury itself has no toxicity. The harm of mercury comes from making tissues deficient in selenium. Then the selenium enzymes don't work, and colloquially all hell breaks loose. Oxidative damage exists in the brain, in the heart, and everywhere else. This is not directly due to mercury. It's due to mercury binding and creating a selenium deficiency in tissues.
So if I could ask a follow-up question, and that I think I know the answer to Nick, can you recreate in an experimental system the same kind of symptoms of, let's say, mercury toxicity by simply making an animal selenium deficient? No mercury at all, just selenium deficient.
Yep. The selenium homeostasis is so excellent. The only way you can make a brain selenium deficient is adding a ton of mercury. And that only happens, like I said, if you're eating whale meat. None of the ocean fish that are commercially available will ever have a excess of mercury. However, one thing that the EPA did that was very insightful was they asked us to come up with an equation that mothers could trust, because they don't want to hear this much mercury, that much selenium. It's too complicated. They want something simple. They had us create the health benefit value, which if there's too much mercury relative to selenium, it's a negative number. We shouldn't be eating any of that type of seafood. But all ocean fish, commercially available ocean fish, have positive health benefit values. We call it HBVs, but health benefit value is the only reliable index there is of risk associated with any of the mercury exposures. And it's not a seafood issue, but freshwater fish here and there across the world can have more mercury than selenium. And so those need to be investigated, and EPA is altering its focus to looking at freshwater fish in the United States. And I've been across Europe, South America. We're talking with folks in Asia. The health benefit values in some of those places are negative. They need to address it. But ocean fish is actually the best solution if there is a population that's exposed to too much mercury. Bring them some ocean fish. It's the best source of selenium for preventing mercury toxicity.
This afternoon's session will be on consumer outreach, how to help consumers fall in love with seafood. So we're going to address the how to actually get consumers to love seafood. And on your table, there's a summary of benefits for seafood consumption, and the FDA net effects report that Mr. Phil Spiller had referenced is on one of the pages, which is the top 10 seafood consumed in the U.S. And per that report, the upper weekly limit that you can eat before any mercury risk. So, for example, for salmon, you can have 53 pounds per week before you hit mercury risk. So I just wanted to let you know that you know, risk is relative. There's risks to everyday life. There's also benefits to what we do in our daily lives as well. And so it's all about balance.